Andrew stood at the edge of the cornfield, breathing like he'd just sprinted out of a nightmare he wasn't allowed to remember. The sky above him was choked with a color no one could name, neither gray, nor blue, nor storm. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat, and in his trembling hand was a rusted metal flash drive that hadn't existed 3 minutes ago. You saw it too, didn't you? That moment. The static flicker in the air, like reality glitched for half a second. And in that flicker, something entered. No one screamed. No one noticed. Only you. And Andrew. And maybe, whoever left that thing behind. You don't remember clicking this video. But here you are, and something deep in your chest knows this isn't entertainment. This is a warning, or maybe a confession, or both. It started with a whisper. Not a dramatic scream, not a cry for help, just a whisper that slid beneath the noise of the world. A man at a crowded farmer's market in Missouri, name was Brian, mid-30s, quiet type, just froze, completely still, like someone hit pause on his body but forgot to pause the world around him. Then he whispered something to no one, something soft, something no one else around him understood. But a 5-year-old girl standing beside her mother turned her head and repeated it, word for word, perfect pitch. That word. It wasn't from any language on earth. Not yet. And when authorities tried to question the girl, she didn't remember saying anything. Her mother swore she'd never heard that word before. 2 hours later, Brian was gone. No trace, no phone pings, no financial transactions. Just deleted. And the worst part? Surveillance footage showed something impossible. In the exact moment he vanished, every electronic device in a 5-mile radius recorded a single heartbeat. One. Louder than anything else. No one covered the story. Not because it wasn't real, but because it couldn't be. How do you tell people something they're biologically wired to deny? But I know you felt it. The unease when someone says your name before you tell them. The way your blood turns cold when a stranger finishes. Your sentence, or that dream where you're not alone even though no one else should be in the room. You brushed it off. Everyone does. But you shouldn't have. Because that's not paranoia, that's memory. Memory of something we buried centuries ago. Something engineered into us. Back in 1983, a declassified military experiment titled Project Wellspring was quietly sealed away. Officially, it was labeled a failed genetics initiative to cure inherited diseases. But one of the scientists, Dr. Sandra Whitlow, left a voice message on an answering machine 3 days before she disappeared forever. Her voice shook with panic. She didn't mention DNA or genomes or test results. She just said one thing. We didn't build the code. We found it. What code? The answer hid in fragments across bloodlines, traced not by ancestry, but by trauma. The more pain someone had survived, the more active the pattern became in their genes, like a living algorithm responding to emotional catastrophe. And when triggered, it rewrites what it means to be human. Not evolution, not mutation. Something much older, something inserted. Andrew's flash drive is real. On it are video logs, classified military footage, distorted, silent. But one stands out. Frame by frame, it shows a man in a hospital gown, levitating 6 inches off a metal table. No wires, no magnets, just him. Eyes wide, unblinking. And then, his mouth moves. He says a name. Your name, no one else heard it. But you did, and that's why you're still here. But here's the part that tears open everything you thought was safe. 10 hours ago, a baby was born in Colorado. Healthy, strong, no complications. But when the nurse lifted her from her mother's arms, the child turned her head, locked eyes with the doctor, and spoke. A full sentence. Not in English, not in any known tongue. But the nurse fainted. The doctor hasn't spoken since. The footage, yes, there's footage, was wiped. But a transcription was leaked. The translation? She's awake now. She knows who broke the seal. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the internet, where the real stories hide behind encrypted mirrors. One question is surfacing again and again, like a ripple from something massive moving beneath the surface. What happens when the code finishes writing itself? Because someone, or something, wrote the beginning, and now it's writing the end. The words echoed in Andrew's mind long after the screen went black, the chilling phrase replaying like a scratched record. She's awake now. She knows. Who broke the seal? But as the hours slipped into restless, sleepless nights, something inside him began to unravel. Was it possible that the flash drive, those grainy, shadowed images, were just fragments of a fevered dream, twisted by his own fractured memories? The truth, the real truth, started to feel slippery, like smoke slipping through his fingers. Just when he reached out, what had he really seen? What had he imagined? And more terrifying, what had he forgotten? The paranoia crept in quietly at first, like the faint buzz of a damaged speaker. He would swear he heard whispers, just beneath the hum of his apartment's faulty air conditioner, voices weaving in and out of white noise. Sometimes a phrase would emerge, almost familiar but scrambled, leaving him grasping at meanings that slipped away like shadows. Other times his phone would glitch, the screen flickering with distorted images. Faces half-formed, eyes too wide, lips moving but silent. When he'd look back, the images were gone, replaced by the blank home screen as if nothing had happened. No logs, no messages, nothing. He started doubting his own senses, questioning the fine line between what was real and what was fracture. Memories from the last few days, no, weeks, blurred like smudged ink on an old letter. Events he thought he'd lived through felt foreign, as if someone had edited his mind, leaving holes where clarity should be. He couldn't tell if the erasure was external, something invasive and deliberate, or if his mind was crumbling under the weight of what he'd uncovered. Was he breaking down, or was something else breaking in? That's when Elle appeared. She came into his life like a half-remembered dream, a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through his walls of denial. She said she was a journalist, someone chasing the real unsolved mystery behind the stories no one dared touch. She claimed she knew about Project Wellspring, about the code hidden deep in human DNA, about the things they don't want you to remember. Her voice was low, urgent, like she was trying to pull him out of the fog that clung to his mind. But there was something off about Ella, something that made Andrew hesitate, a flicker of doubt that grew with every passing moment. Her presence was magnetic and unsettling. She showed up at odd hours, slipping cryptic notes under his door, sharing fragments of hidden recordings that seemed to contradict everything Andrew thought he knew. One tape had a woman's voice, calm but broken, speaking of unlocking what sleeps beneath the soul. But the voice wasn't Sandra Whitlow's. It was hers. Or was it? The recording would stutter, loop, then cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed down on his chest. Andrew wanted to trust Ellie. He needed to. But sometimes when she talked about the code and the baby that spoke the unknown name, her eyes would glaze over for a moment, as if she were hearing something no one else could. Sometimes her story didn't line up. She'd recall places they'd never been, conversations they never had. And there were nights when Andrew woke up to find her gone, only to discover notes he didn't remember writing scattered around the apartment, filled with questions he hadn't asked aloud. Fear wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was inside Andrew's skin, crawling beneath his ribs, whispering in the spaces between heartbeats. He wasn't sure if he was being hunted, or if the hunt was inside him. The line blurred. The nightmare folded in on itself until the only certainty was doubt. One night, as a storm rattled the windows and the city outside pulsed with electricity, Andrew sat alone, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop. The flash drive sat beside him, inert but humming with the promise of something unseen. He clicked a folder he hadn't dared open before. The files inside were labeled in a language he didn't understand, symbols that looked like DNA strands, twisted into shapes no human tongue could name. A video started playing. The screen was dark. Then a face appeared, Andrew's face. But he wasn't the man staring back at him. The eyes were too wide, the expression too hollow. And then he heard it, soft but unmistakable. A voice whispering his name, a name he never told anyone. And in that whisper, a truth slammed into him so hard it almost broke him. He had never been alone. Not really. Elle's voice crackled from the speakers, distorted and distant. "You're part of it, Andrew. You always were. What they don't want you to remember is that the code isn't just in the blood, it's in the mind. And once it wakes, there's no going back." And in that moment, Andrew understood. He was both the hunter and the hunted, the key and the lock, the truth and the lie. But which was real, and which was a secret they buried deep in the DNA of every human soul, waiting for the right moment to break free. The flash drive blinked once, then disappeared from the screen. The room fell silent. Outside, the storm was gone. And Andrew, trembling, knew this was only the beginning of a story no one alive dared to finish. For a while, Andrew thought he had cracked it. The fragments finally clicked together, the puzzle pieces aligning in a way that felt less like a conspiracy and more like truth. It was a rare moment, fragile and glowing, like the first ray of sunlight after a long, suffocating night. He sat alone in his dim apartment, the weight of months of confusion and sleepless paranoia, lifting just enough for hope to crawl in. The flash drive held the key. The code wasn't alien. It was human. It was history. It was something buried beneath layers of official lies and erased memories. A truth they had buried deep enough that even his own mind had tried to forget. Andrew found an old file, one that hadn't been scrubbed from the archives, hidden behind a wall of redacted papers. It was a research report from the late 1940s, an experiment labeled only as Project Lazarus. The details were chilling but straightforward. A small group of soldiers had been subjected to experimental treatments, genetic manipulation, chemical serums, psychological conditioning, to create a new breed of human, supersoldiers, weapons of war that could endure trauma beyond the limits of the mind and body. But the project had been abandoned, classified as a failure when the subjects started, exhibiting anomalies, memories that didn't belong to them, voices that echoed from nowhere. And then the patients started to disappear, vanishing into thin air or breaking reality itself. Official records concluded the project was terminated and all evidence destroyed. But Andrew had found something else, an old VHS tape buried in a forgotten military box, dated 1951. It showed one of the subjects, a man named Harold Fisher, sitting in a sterile room. He was pale, eyes wide, trembling as he spoke to an unseen interrogator. The camera's grain blurred his face, but his words cut through the haze like a knife. "They're watching, always watching. Not just us, but everything. Inside us, it's waiting, and it knows what we're hiding." The tape ended with a static burst that lingered too long, almost like it was resisting silence. As Andrew watched, a shiver ran through his spine, not just because of the words, but because something about Harold's face was hauntingly familiar. He blinked and the image warped, flickering like a bad dream. And then the unthinkable happened. The VHS player short-circuited. The screen went dark and a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably clear, filled the room. "You're not crazy. They lied to you." The floodgates opened. Andrew's memories began to unravel, not in neat chronological order, but in shards and echoes like a fractured mirror reflecting a past he thought was his own. There were flashes of a hospital room bathed in cold fluorescent light, a mother's sobbing, a man's hand slipping from a grasp too soon. An event so long buried it felt like it belonged to someone else, yet it beat in rhythm with the terror, clawing at his chest now. It was the same vanishing act, the same whispered name no one else heard, the same silence that swallowed whole the people who crossed a certain line. He remembered the fear, but not the cause. The trauma, but not the trigger. A memory glitch, a missing piece, a secret they didn't want him to find. Elle reappeared just then, her eyes darker, more urgent than before. She spoke of an older force, something that had been watching from the beginning, lurking in the shadows of every experiment, every suppressed file, every erased name. Not a being, not a machine, but a presence. Psychological, atmospheric, deeply personal, that wormed its way into minds and memories like a virus. It fed on doubt, on fear, on the very essence of what made them human. It wasn't named because naming it would give it form, and form meant limits. This thing had none. Andrew wanted to run, to scream, to forget again. But the walls were closing in. The apartment felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the very space around him breathed with a living menace. He reached for the flash drive, desperate for answers, but the device was gone, vanished without a trace, like the people before him, like the memories he couldn't trust. And then, in the deepest quiet, a realization struck him so sharply he gasped. The flash drive, the tapes, the voices, even Elle might all be part of it. The story, the mystery, the so-called truth he'd uncovered. What if it was just another layer of the lie? A trap designed to keep him chasing shadows, fracturing his mind, drowning in the horror of a secret that was never meant to be solved? He sat frozen, the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions pressing down on him. The screen flickered one last time, and there, barely visible in the static, was a single word written backwards. Restart. And in that moment, Andrew understood. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. And every truth he thought he had grasped was a question waiting to be asked again, this time with even more at stake. You're not crazy. But maybe, just maybe, you've been watching the wrong story all along. They're not alone. That much became painfully clear the night Andrew's phone buzzed with an incoming message from a number he didn't recognize. A string of characters, nothing legible at first, but within seconds, the screen decoded a phrase that sent a chill deeper than any cold wind could. You were right all along. No sender ID, no callback number. Just the unsettling certainty that someone somewhere was watching. Not watching him alone, watching all of them. Those like Andrew, tangled in a web too vast to see, too complex to understand, yet impossible to escape. It wasn't just a one-off. Over the following nights, Andrew began to notice patterns. Cryptic symbols etched subtly into random corners of his world. Graffiti on a brick wall, a sticker on a lamppost, the eerie reflection of a sign flashing in the window of a passing car. Each symbol, strange, almost alien, felt like a breadcrumb trail meant only for those who dared to look closer. The same symbols flickered in his dreams, shadows weaving in and out of familiar places, muttering in languages half remembered, half imagined. They weren't random. They were a secret language, a code shared among a hidden network, an underground current connecting others caught in the same invisible snare, because Andrew wasn't the only one whose reality was cracking. Somewhere in Ohio, a woman named Marissa woke to the same whispered words that had haunted Andrew, words no one else heard, phrases burned into the night air that left her gasping, heart pounding like a warning drumbeat. She'd found a faded Polaroid in her late grandfather's belongings, marked with the very same symbol Andrew had seen, and a date scrawled beneath. July 1974. The picture was of a nondescript farmhouse, but standing in the doorway was a man with eyes too knowing, a face too familiar for comfort. Marissa's memories of childhood felt like gaps in a jigsaw puzzle missing its edges, snippets of fear, unexplainable disappearances, and a mother who refused to talk about that time. In California, another man, Derek, had recorded strange noises on a police scanner, the same warped static and whispered names from Andrew's tapes. He'd also uncovered old, unmarked VHS footage from 20 years ago, hidden deep within a forgotten storage locker. The footage was raw, grainy, showing shadowed figures moving silently through corridors of an abandoned military base. At one point, a child appeared on screen, eyes wide, unblinking, speaking a name no one dared say out loud. The tape cut abruptly, leaving a lingering silence so thick it pressed into Derek's chest. No one had ever released that footage to the public. No one wanted the world to see what the government never released. And now, through this fractured network of shadows, Andrew and the others were connected, not by chance but by design. The messages came in waves, each more urgent than the last. Fragments of shared dreams where they met, spoke in riddles, exchanged warnings in voices tinged with desperation. They saw flashes of places none of them had ever visited, rooms painted in the same sterile white, hallways lined with mirrors that reflected distorted versions of themselves, and walls that pulsed with a heartbeat that wasn't their own. Each dream ended the same way, a looming presence just beyond sight, watching with eyes that burned into their souls, waiting for a moment to step from shadow into light. Andrew's grip on his own identity began to falter. Who was he really? The man staring back from the mirror felt both himself and a stranger, memories he couldn't claim, emotions that belonged to someone else. The line between what he remembered and what was implanted blurred until he could no longer tell where he ended and where the code began. Were his thoughts truly his own, or echoes of a program running deep inside his DNA? And if they were watching, always watching, were they controlling more than just his memories? Were they shaping his very soul? It was then that a new voice entered the periphery, a third perspective, something entirely different. Unlike the fractured, desperate signals Andrew and the others shared, this voice was calm, distant, almost clinical. It came through a series of encrypted transmissions intercepted by Derek, a series of logs from someone who called themselves the Observer. The Observer spoke of timelines and experiments, of patterns and cycles, of a force that had infiltrated humanity long before Andrew or his allies had even been born. They described the code not as an error or accident, but as an inevitable evolution, an awakening force threading through every generation, rewriting the rules of identity and free will. But the Observer warned of something darker, something lurking beneath the surface of all their discoveries, a force too vast and ancient to name, whose reach was psychological as much as physical. This entity thrived on doubt, on fractures within the self, on the breaking points where memory failed and fear blossomed. It was a hunter that didn't need to chase. It was already inside. As Andrew listened to the fragmented transmissions, his pulse quickened with a growing dread. This was not a story about hidden experiments or super soldiers anymore. It was a story about the fragile architecture of reality itself, about the thin, trembling thread that separated sanity from oblivion. And now, with every message received and every symbol deciphered, the line between observer and participant blurred until it vanished altogether. Because the truth they sought wasn't just out there, buried beneath layers of lies and classified files. It was inside each of them. The screen flickered, once more alive with static and cryptic symbols. The last message scrawled in fading text sent a cold wave through Andrew's mind. You've been part of this from the beginning. There is no outside. There is no escape. What you think is real is just the next layer of the game. And in that silence, charged with a terrible energy and unspoken promise, the story demanded a choice: to look away or to dive deeper into the abyss where identity, memory, and control tangled like serpents waiting to strike. The screen blinked black, and in the darkness, the question lingered, sharper than ever. What if everything you've seen is only the beginning? Andrew sat, alone in the cold glow of his computer screen, the weight of every secret, every fractured memory pressing down like a relentless storm. It wasn't the question of what that had pulled him into this labyrinth anymore. The whispers, the vanished people, the coded messages, they all paled beneath the terrifying gravity of why. Why had this hidden force, this unknown architect, of his fractured reality, woven itself so tightly into the very essence of who he was? Why had it chosen him, and others like him, to bear the burden of a truth so vast it threatened to unravel everything he believed about himself, about humanity? He closed his eyes and the memories flooded in. no longer scattered fragments but a torrent crashing over him. A childhood lived in the shadows of silence, moments of laughter now tinged with an unbearable ache. The faces of those he loved, now twisted by absence and lies. He remembered his mother's whispered warnings, his father's distant eyes, the way the world seemed to shift just slightly out of sync, as if reality itself was holding its breath. The truth was no longer a puzzle. It was a mirror, reflecting the deepest parts of his soul that he had long ignored. There was a painful confession, buried beneath layers of fear and denial, that clawed its way to the surface. Andrew had wanted to believe the mystery was external, a conspiracy, something other than himself, because the alternative was too raw, too intimate. What if the secret was not an outside force invading from afar, but the very core of his own being? What if the code in his DNA was a message not of alien conquest or scientific experiment, but of evolution and loss, a scar left by a distant past trying to remind him that the line between human and something else had always been blurred, that the struggle wasn't against an enemy, but against the fragments of himself he was afraid to face. In the silence that followed, Andrew felt a tremor ripple through his bones. The fragile barrier between nightmare and waking life began to dissolve. The voices he had heard, the shadows he had chased, the symbols etched in the corners of his mind. They weren't meant to trap him. They were a call, a summons to awaken from a dream he never knew he was living. But awakening demanded a choice, to let the truth consume him, to dissolve the fragile self he clung to, or to rise, fractured but whole, into a new understanding of what it meant to be human. Elle's voice, fragile yet steady, pierced through his storm. You don't have to carry this alone. Whatever this is, whatever they are, you can face it, but only if you stop running from who you really are. Andrew's breath caught, the moment stretching into eternity. It was no longer about uncovering hidden files or decrypting coded messages. It was about embracing the terrifying, beautiful complexity of existence itself. The mystery wasn't just a story to be solved. It was the silent echo of humanity's deepest fear and greatest hope intertwined. As the screen dimmed, Andrew whispered into the shadows, a truth more profound than any secret code. Maybe the real secret isn't in what's hidden deep inside us, but in how we choose to face it when it finally comes to light. And with that, the story didn't end. It unfolded, endless, haunting, raw, like the fragile pulse of life itself, forever asking the question that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for stories you were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, some truths don't want to be found.